Hello, everyone. Today we will explore a deeply disturbing but often overlooked form of child on child violence, also known as siblicide. Specifically, we will discuss two infamous cases, those of Joshua Phillips and Lionel Tate. To understand the psychological and societal factors behind this tragedy phenomenon. Siblicide, defined as the killing of one sibling by another, is a extremely rare event. It dates back to Adam and Eve, their first two sons, the story of Cain and Abel. But when it happens, the shock waves are immense. It forces us to confront even questions about behavior, the impact in the childhood of, these kids. So, God even showed me another case of even a 6-year-old boy that killed his 13-year-old sister while the mother left them in the car, which I may come back to later to speak on more, because I want to first, do my homework by myself, before sharing. But we want to look at these extremes, pushed by envy or rage, jealousy. It can push someone even to the point of no return, obviously, when they commit murdering another human being. No matter anymore the age, it is sad to say the age continues to be even lower than the last, because the two boys we are talking about in depth today are just 12 and 14 years of age, and their victims are only 6 and an 8-year-old. But we will unpack, these complex questions by looking at the lives and actions of the two individuals also involved, in these highly publicized, cases. Joshua Phillips and Lionel Tate. First, let's define siblicide in more, of detail, which would be, while it is mentioned incredibly rare, instances of child harming are even killing, their sibling or a playmate, a cousin, our neighbor, have been cased in point, because one, case happened across one culture, it's also been at another. So that doesn't change either. Just statistics studies shows us that siblicide accounts for a very small percentage of child homicides. However, the frequency and horror of these incidents raise significant questions, right? About the relationship first with their own siblings, their parents, the psychological conditions, that might drive such behavior, and the emotional environment in which these, children are raised. Um, these incidents also seem more prevalent with boy and girl instead of, the other way around. But it's important to consider that children who engage in siblicide are often victims of trauma themselves. Many of these cases involve children, from broken homes, environments filled with violence, in instances of neglect and or abuse. By the motivation and factors at play here, in these events are incredibly nuanced, and should be examined in context. Let's start with Joshua Phillips. At the time of his conviction in Jacksonville, Florida, he was convicted of murdering Maddie Clifton. The crime shocked the community and the nation for its brutality and the circumstances surrounding even tragic and perplexing. Josh, 14, was a quiet, often isolated child. He had a difficult relationship with his parents. His father was quite physical, abusive to Josh, and he often would lash out on him after work, taking his frustrations with life out on his child. His mother was the type that would just look away from the situation, allowing it to happen and doing nothing about it, which points to emotionally cold, in the household. So, in the months leading up to the murder, Josh had reportedly was then experiencing, anxiety, depression, and a growing sense of, I'd say, isolation or even alienation. He later showed he feared the wrath of his father more than society and even justice. On the day of the murder, Josh invited Maddie into the house to play, as they had done on occasion, despite his father's rule that no one was allowed in his home when he was not there. So, after a brief argument, Josh struck Maddie with a metal rod, then proceeded to strangle her. He then hid her body under his waterbed. Remember those? I remember my parents even having one when I was a child. But the police later discovered that Josh had not only killed Maddie, but had been in deliberate with his concealing the crime for several days. Uh, he had even cut her throat later and stabbed her 7 times in her chest when he heard her moaning or crying while under his bed. After historically, the prosecutor arguing that the manner in which Maddie was killed, the hiding of her body, participating even in the search, and having a missing persons flyer of her in his bedroom cannot be discounted. His initial attempts to evade suspicion seems to be the result of panic, rather than any cold or heartless, malice. When Josh, though, was arrested, the trial also raised important questions, about the psychological development of children and their capacity for violence, even deciding trying as an adult, right? In his defense, though, it was argued that Joshua acted out of fear and confusion, not premeditated intent. His father, um, later we found out, only visited him once during his trial at the jail and played chess with him, but didn't even ask him about his crime or his feelings. His defense team painted a picture of a deeply troubled boy who had struggled to cope with emotional trauma, lack of support, and a broken family. Um, that environment, growing up in. The Phillips is, that case anyway, raised a critical question. What drives a child to commit such a horrific act? Was it the result of violence in his home life? Was Josh mimicking violent behavior he had witnessed, even? Was the product that came of it, untreated mental health issues too, I would ask. So now let's turn to the case of Lionel Tate, another high profile case that illustrates the tragic and complex nature of siblicide. Lionel was a 12-year-old boy from Florida as well. When he was convicted in 2010 of murdering his 6-year-old girl and him just 12, her name was Tiffany Unick, his cousin and playmate. In the months leading up to the crime, Lionel had been practicing wrestling moves before Tiffany, because his father, being absent after being physically violent in front of him with his mother, and got him hooked on watching WWE wrestling on TV at a very young age. I find it fascinating that the first point was that him being the youngest person in the United States ever to be sentenced to life in prison, but also both Johnny Cochran was his defense attorney, who also was the defense attorney for O.J. Simpson, and they called the famous WWE star Dwayne Johnson, also the male voice on Moana, and known as The Rock, was called to testify, even subpoenaed for Lionel's defense. They wanted jurors to see how pro wrestlers, pull punches, choreograph, I'd say body slams, and see, they synchronize, their moves so they don't hurt each other while making this televised, action appear authentic. Hmm. My thought there is great for the jury, but did he or anyone else have that conversation before that day in question with Lionel? Because the boy was mimicking such moves, quite bigger and heavier than Tiffany. He didn't realize the injuries that could cause, when he allegedly gave tiny Tiffany a bear hug and then dropped her on the table and then swung her around, hitting the railing. That fateful afternoon, Lionel and Tiffany were playing in his home. His mother testified that she was asleep upstairs. During a tragic turn of events, Lionel performed a wrestling maneuver on her, first causing her to fall. He then proceeded to strike her in the head, resulting in her death. Lionel claimed that he never intended to kill Tiffany and that the death occurred as a result of his wrestling moves. However, the medical examiner found that Tiffany had sustained blunt force trauma, and the injuries indicated that Lionel's actions had gone beyond what would have been, an innocent game of wrestling. Lionel's defense team even argued that he did not fully understand the consequences of his actions and that he was mimicking only, violent acts he had seen professional wrestling, where over the top and dangerous even moves are portrayed without regard for safety. His background was also examined with experts, noting that he had grown up in a very abusive environment, witnessing violence between his mother and her partners. This trauma, they argued, may have played a role in Lionel's inability to recognize the danger in his actions. Lionel Tate's case promoted debates even about the influence of both home and media violence, particularly in child's their understanding of physical aggression, right? At a very young age watching TV. Many experts, though, also questioned the ability of a 12-year-old to truly comprehend, though, the nature of murder and whether he should be, held accountable for his actions. TV, so common, and in the threads between both of these cases, even, we leads back to nature versus nurture. When we examine both Joshua Phillips and Lionel Tate cases, we begin to see some overlapping, themes that might help us better understand the phenomenon of siblicide. Both boys came from challenging backgrounds that, um, Joshua Phillips being, I'd say, emotionally distant and abusive family, while Lionel Tate grew up in, environment where both his parents, were violent in their relationships, as well as, in both cases, I'd say the lack of healthy emotional guidance, coupled with exposure to violent or traumatic experiences, it seems to have a role that was played in the violent acts, that were committed. So, It raises the question, right, of whether violence in the media or real life can even desensitize children to the consequences of their actions. Um, I would also add lack of emotional intelligence. This could be particularly attributed to the trauma they endured at an early age, but it also points to a failure in providing them with the necessary emotional and psychological support to understand things like empathy, guilt, or remorse. Lastly, the psychological perspective, understanding why children might commit such horrific acts remains complex. We know that children are still developing their understanding of right and wrong. Their moral reasoning, even, is not fully formed. And they often also act impulsively without considering the long term consequences. In both of these cases, there was a lack of maturity, so their moral reasoning isn't, formed, then they also don't have the ability to empathize, to grasp even the finality of death in itself, and to understand the enormity of, the crime, they committed. Uh, they were doing something or did something that compromised both their mental and emotional states. They were, in many ways, children who had not fully learned how to process their trauma or understand the emotional and social consequences of their actions. Finally, I would share with you an update on both of these boys today, since the law also has changed, allowing them to be offered the opportunity at parole as they approach now close to the age of 30. I sat in on both of them and the parole hearings, and it was heartbreaking. This is hard to talk about because we're talking about, kids. But starting with Joshua Phillips, experts testified that Joshua was not showing accountability, still largely blaming his father for what happened. And that is or was, the abuse that scared him. He was even told he should write a letter of apology to Maddie's parents, and he denied, any interest. He said no. So, um, yet firmly reminded that his father, in the end, did not murder Maddie Clifton. He did. Maddie's parents were there making tearful pleas toward um, being against him being released, that he hadn't taken responsibility and that the public should be even protected. They also said they will be at every parole hearing he is offered every couple of years to remind him of the impact he has caused on their life as well as that of Maddie's siblings. He was denied parole and sent back to prison. Now, Lionel Tate testimony was he participated in programs, and Tiffany's mother even testified she forgives Lionel and does not blame him solely for what happened. So, Lionel was granted parole. However, not long after his release, he robbed a pizza delivery man at gunpoint while he was carrying a concealed weapon violates his probation. Back in prison, he had demonstrated violence outbursts, blaming everyone but himself for being back in prison. He took the plea bargain of another 30 years in prison when confronted with overwhelming evidence on camera and the witnesses ready to testify against him for his new charges of armed robbery, burglary, battery, even another person on the scene, and refusing to answer questions about where he got the gun or where he later disposed of it. So, understand the 30 years is for the probation violation. on his life sentence of first-degree murder, and he got another 10 years to run for the other charges. And Florida's 4th District Court of Appeal upheld that sentence. So, I want to share with you, I have a note here, because thinking back to my career as even when I worked at New Alternatives as a crisis counselor, over the years, I saw many show that tough guy routine, observed the boys and the girls, the teenagers that they would have, vulgar mouth, stubborn, and could get aggressive when provoked. I remember one conversation, even, I will share with you, that I had with this kid that was maybe 15. I asked him, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" He said, "Join the Navy SEALs because it would be my chance to give a big fuck you to the U.S. government." I corrected him by saying, "No, actually, it would be you working for the U.S. government. And if you can't learn the rules while doing so and show, disrespect, they will virtually say that to you because they will kick you out of the SEALs, right?" So, sorry, I think back at that kid and what he may have ended up doing today. So, the kid, though, was already awaiting for his court hearing for both possession of drugs and a weapon. He said about that, "I know that I messed up with what I was doing, but I don't have remorse. Um, I guess I am like my father, but I don't know because I have not seen him for years." Most of these kids today that are in juvenile hall do not have a stable relationship with their parents. Absent, father or mother, on welfare, already having taught them what their addiction may be, of anything else, though it seems, that pleases them except their child, right? The one that actually needs love most. Children are different from adults. Neuroscience, tells us that young people lack impulse control, judgment, and the ability to assess risks and consequences. Starting in 2013, though, the law would grant youth tried as adults a chance to parole after serving 15 years. At the state level, there is a rise in opposition, calling kids today that have committed these terrible, even violent crimes before they're 15 years old and at the age of 30 want to be considered for parole. Quote from one senator, the one in DC, because he said, "These are evil, menacing people, mini Charlie Mansons even. This is absolutely outrageous that we're going to release those little psychopaths back into the streets to yet murder again." He goes on, but the urge of his no vote, thinking of, what their many minds might have already learned, right? I say then, locked up after over a decade with the worst possible people, the inmates, in the world, right? Did they click up with that crowd mentally or decide to still be and think better? We can only wonder, did their parents go to see them and give them, hope for a better relationship? Starting right there, did they get an education, and or become willing to learn a trade so that they can support themselves, outside the jail? Also, the staff at the detention centers keep report on individuals to help better understand progress or lack thereof in their, disciplinary records. I know many like myself, that try hard to reach inside these troubled kids, becoming young adults, telling them, I want to help you see what you are capable of, no matter your past, if you really want it. But the problem is, they have to want it. Reality says, some will pretend they do and work the program, but their drawings or what they write in their journal, even their conversations that they are having, paint a very different picture. It is so very sad. And society is already calling them little monsters. Remember the kids I told you, that I had even cared for when removed from the home at Polinsky centers. I told you that I cared for these kids that were beaten, babies even, stabbed also. We expect them to not let the abuse they endured play a part in their decision making. I remember that quote, though, said from even the 12-year-old that was facing prison time. He said, I got no love, so I show no love. Awesome. Now, what does society expect us to do with that, right? So, finally, I'd close it with the other note I had because I thought it to be the best conclusion. Because as a society, we continue to address the issues of childhood trauma, domestic violence, and the potential effects of even media violence, right? Including video games, too. Only through understanding and intervention can we hope to prevent such tragedies in the future. Thank you for your attention. And I know I am encouraging your thoughts on this topic, and please comment below on them. Until next time, take care. Bye, guys.